A new president who had promised so much was faced with crisis and conflict. In the Deep South, racial tensions grew violent in the early 1960s as those who promoted social change were met with savage resistance by those like the Ku Klux Klan who favored strict segregationist policies. But President Kennedy was also well aware that it was the support of the Dixiecrats, or Southern Democrats, many of whom favored segregation, that made possible his election in 1960. Faced with this growing conflict, Kennedy had to choose between placating his constituency or compromising his political future to bring about social justice and reform. Neutralizing the power of white Southerners in Congress was needed, however, to make any progress on this front. Kennedy was deeply concerned that this action would compromise his ability to push his initiative of tax and education reform and aid for the elderly through Congress, which depended on their support. His internal conflict over civil rights and maintaining his Southern Democratic base were about to reach a crescendo.
It affected American society in a large way because the Jim Crow signs had to be taken down. Oh, there was just conflict after conflict after conflict. That was a big change for American society.
The next great civil rights battles that Kennedy would face involved the integration of college campuses in the racially divided states of Mississippi and Alabama. Here, Kennedy would not only hold the line of his determination to see these schools integrated, but in the process, he would compromise his own political future in doing so. James Meredith, a 29-year-old Air Force veteran, would be the impetus for change. Meredith had recently won a case to become the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi. The responsibility to ensure that Meredith was admitted rested with Governor Ross Barnett, a fervent segregationist. As Meredith was set to enter the campus, an angry mob gathered to stop him. Kennedy ordered federal marshals to accompany Meredith, but Barnett ordered the withdrawal of state troopers who were supposed to provide Meredith and the marshals with additional support. Now, the few marshals on duty were all that stood between Meredith and the ever-growing, angered wall of hate. At this point, President Kennedy tried to placate Governor Barnett to take action. As the president addressed the nation on the escalating situation, tensions turned violent in Mississippi. Molotov cocktails and rocks were thrown, and gunshots rang out. Kennedy had no choice but to send federal troops to Mississippi. By the next morning, the campus was secured, but not before 2 were dead and dozens more injured. President Kennedy knew full well the repercussions he would face in the upcoming midterm elections. The Dixiecrats would grow vigorously anti-Kennedy in their campaigns, but the president's efforts did produce a greater avenue for compromise with the more liberal politicians in the North. Also, his actions helped bring many more blacks into the Democratic Party.
John Kennedy, he changed the landscape and caused a tremendous transition of blacks from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. So our modern support of the Democratic Party essentially was initiated during the John Kennedy years.
But Kennedy's attempts to appease Dixiecrats and segregationists such as Ross Barnett left many questioning his motives. Numerous civil rights advocates now felt a sense of distrust. As Kennedy continued to walk the line of compromise between the two sides, conflict in Birmingham, Alabama would once again force the president into a crisis over protecting civil rights or maintaining his base among Southern Democrats. But as civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. pressured Kennedy for action, he also planned a massive protest in Birmingham, a hotbed of racial conflict and tension. Kennedy's worst fears were now coming to fruition. The protests would be broadcast worldwide. Communists would exploit this as a sign of weakness, and Southern Democrats would be outraged and make inroads into blocking Kennedy's reforms that he saw as absolutely vital. As Birmingham erupted, images of racial unrest unfolded on television screens across the nation. King's actions in Birmingham escalated further on May 2, 1963, when he mobilized hundreds of children some as young as 6, to march into the city. Awaiting them was Police Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, a living symbol of the segregationist South. Hundreds were arrested, and scenes of water cannons being used against the marchers, children included, became images that were burned into the nation's collective memory. The New York Times called it a national disgrace. Kennedy again tried a path of compromise. However, segregationists refused to deal directly with Dr. King, and Kennedy once again was left in a difficult political position. Faced with this growing racial conflict and division within his own party, Kennedy once again would show his fortitude. With law and order slowly being restored, Kennedy would face down yet another challenge in Alabama, this time from Governor George C. Wallace. Wallace, like Ross Barnett of Mississippi, was a strict segregationist and would take his own stand against the integration of a college campus in his state. Defying a court order to allow 2 black students to enter the University of Alabama, Wallace made his infamous stand in the schoolhouse door to personally keep the students from entering. Kennedy, enraged by Wallace's blatant defiance of a court order, now at last took decisive action. He ordered the Justice Department to take out an injunction against Wallace. This, combined with enormous political pressure, caused the controversial Alabama governor to back down. As Wallace stepped aside, the doors of the University of Alabama were at last open to black students. Kennedy's next move was indeed a bold one. On June 11, 1963, he delivered a nationally televised civil rights address. This time, in a very uncompromising fashion, he proved to the nation and the world that the tenets of equality and justice would be upheld, and argued that new legislation was needed to diffuse the growing racial conflict and division.
Nationwide legislation is needed if we are to move this problem from the streets to the courts. I'm also asking Congress to authorize the federal government to participate more fully in lawsuits designed to end segregation in public education. We have succeeded in persuading many districts to desegregate voluntarily. Dozens have admitted Negroes without violence.
While civil rights leaders, such as Dr. King, praised the speech, Dixiecrats were left distinctly unimpressed. Kennedy knew full well what he had compromised in order to bring this civil rights conflict to the forefront. Sadly, just a few hours after the speech, there was tragedy. Medgar Evers, a leader in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, was assassinated. Kennedy was horrified. Making matters worse, riots erupted in cities nationwide. While his civil rights address was on point, more work was still needed to be done to put things right. On the day of Evers' funeral, Kennedy sent a proposed civil rights bill to Congress covering voter registration, desegregation measures, and a new community relations service that would address racial issues and force federal contractors and recipients of federal aid to practice non-discrimination. Southern Democrats were outraged, but civil rights leaders also criticized the bill as too lenient on measures protecting civil rights activists such as Medgar Evers. As Kennedy's popularity fell to 47% in national polls, he pressed forward. His chances of re-election without the Dixiecrats' support seemed ruined. But following a meeting with civil rights leaders in late June, and with King's March on Washington in August, in which he delivered his I Have a Dream speech, the president was determined to see the measure through, despite prospects that it would destroy any hope of re-election. Tragically, the assassination of President Kennedy cut short his dream of seeing the legislation passed. But his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, would see that the sweeping civil rights initiatives introduced by Kennedy became law in 1964. Kennedy's courage in the face of his own potential political demise showed the determination and strength of character necessary to promote compromise in the face of those who promoted segregation. While issues of racial discord and conflict still plague our nation, Kennedy's willingness to compromise his political future in the face of racial conflict paved the way for greater justice and equality for those most in need.